Good afternoon, friends. My name is Michael Heintz, and I've been privileged and asked to chair this session. My role is that of John the Baptist. They must increase, I must decrease. That's all I'm going to say about myself. Each of our speakers will have 30 minutes. He may use that time as he sees fit. If he speaks all 30, that's fine. If he has time for Q&A or discussion at the end, that's fine as well. But I'll definitely keep time, not to rush you, but so there's no clock, of course, you can see. So I'll try to help keep time for all of you. It's not been an issue at panel, but the panel earlier, it was not an issue, so I don't expect it to be one today. So our first speaker is Jennings, a doctoral candidate at Baylor University, whose research focuses on medieval philosophy, especially the great Thomas Aquinas and the 13th century context, in particular in the areas of metaphysics, philosophy of mind, and philosophical psychology. He's also interested in putting medieval and contemporary thought into conversation with each other. So let's welcome Jennings.
Thank you all for being here. So the task of my project, can you all hear me? All right, so the task of my project is pretty straightforward. It's to put St. Thomas's account of the Passiones Animae, the passions of the soul, into conversation with the contemporary science of emotion, particularly in psychology. So this is a subject I'm sure you're all very passionate about, so try not to be too emotional during the talk. Sorry. Okay, more seriously, I'm going to start with a few reflections on why this project might be of interest or important. First of all, I think it's just intrinsically interesting, and I'm sure many of you are along the same page there. But second of all, Aquinas' account of the Passions is, I don't think it's too much of an exaggeration to call it probably the most developed and most significant account of the Passions in the entire pre-modern world, at least in the West. So for example, Nicholas Lombardo has done work to, in his estimation, it's the longest sustained discussion of the Passions ever written, up to the point of Aquinas' time. And Peter King has called it the highest expression of a unique and comprehensive theory of emotions in the Middle Ages, and I think that's true of the ancient and medieval period. So it's just interesting, like if this is one of the most significant account of emotions up until the modern period, I think it's worth considering where have we come since then? What do we know today from the sciences? How does that stand in relation to St. Thomas's account? And then for Thomas, or for people who are sympathetic to Thomistic thought, Aquinas is seen as a reliable guide to truth on the one hand, and on the other hand, we know that contemporary modern science is a remarkable tool for discovery of truth of the natural world. So if we have these two authorities, if you will, of truth, it makes sense we want to put them into conversation with each other and see if what they say is compatible, incompatible, if they can help each other arrive at a further development of understanding of an area such as emotion, which is a very central part of our experience as human persons. But then there's one final reason, which is that in contemporary psychology, there's a few families of theories about what the emotion, about what emotion is. There's no like single consensus definition of emotion. But one of the most prominent families of theories is called the appraisal theories. And appraisal theories, their founder and pioneer was a psychologist in the 20th century named Magda Arnold. And in the 1960s, she wrote a 2-volume work called Emotion and Personality, which kind of kick-started this entire appraisal theory of emotion that continues to be a major research program in contemporary psychology. But something that's not known very much, even among Thomas, is that Magda Arnold basically took her theory of emotion directly from Aquinas. Like, we'll see the exact, and she's explicit about this, that she's drawing it from Aquinas. So that's cool, but contemporary psychologists after Magda Arnold haven't gone back to Aquinas. Like, she took her theory from Aquinas, he was her inspiration, but then contemporary psychologists after her took her theory and kind of ran with it and didn't go back to Aquinas. So I think part of my project is I think it's interesting to see okay, they've sort of developed this research program from a figure who's taking from Aquinas as her inspiration. Well, how much of what contemporary psychologists up to today, how much of what they're saying is still in line with Aquinas and his theory of the passions, and how much can the two, are they in conflict? Are they compatible? Again, can they help each other reach a further synthesis of understanding the emotions? So I'm going to try to be very brief. I'm going to go over Aquinas's account of the passions. Then I'm going to go over Magda Arnold's account of emotions. And then I'm going to go over some more recent developments before concluding with some critical discussion about Aquinas's account in relation to contemporary accounts. So very succinctly, Aquinas's definition of a passion is a movement or act of the sensitive appetite. For Aquinas in general, there are three kinds of appetite among all creatures. There's natural appetite, sensitive or animal appetite, and then rational or intellective appetite. Natural appetite is found in every created form as such, living or non-living. Every form has a kind of natural appetite. So according to St. Thomas's general metaphysics, every form as such has a kind of appetite which follows upon it by its very nature. So he writes, quote, "Some inclination follows every form, as fire from its form is inclined into a higher place, and to this that it generates something similar to itself, i.e. it burns things, catches them on fire." So that is, every form has a natural tendency towards its natural ends. Such a natural tendency is characterized by the nature of the form in question. So again, the form of fire has a natural tendency to heat things because the form by its very nature is hot. So its natural tendency is characterized by its own nature. So natural appetite is determined by the nature of the form, but things that have cognition have a special kind of appetite, which follows upon the fact that they aren't just their own forms, they also take in the forms of other things through apprehension. And so this gives rise to a special kind of appetition, which follows upon the apprehension of forms. And so there's two kinds of apprehension for Aquinas. There's sensitive apprehension and intellective apprehension. And so accordingly, there's two types of cognitive appetite. There's sensitive appetite and intellective appetite. And sensitive appetite is where the passions are found. Apprehension is a taking in of the world as it is. Appetition is a kind of going out to the world. So sensitive appetition, which follows sensitive apprehension of the world, is a kind of sensibly felt appetite. It's a sensibly felt inclination or tendency towards apprehended forms. It's also hylomorphic in nature, so it has a form-matter structure. The form is the appetite itself, the act of appetition itself, and the matter is, Aquinas describes as the various bodily transmutations or bodily changes that accompany a passion. So an example that he takes from Aristotle is when you're angry, you feel, Aristotle puts it as blood boiling around the heart. And so this is part of the sensibly felt nature of passion. You're feeling your body react and change in various ways. Any kind of appetition is determined by the formal object given to it by the apprehension that elicits it. So for sense apprehension, it's not just the five external senses that are giving the passion their formal object, but there's also the internal senses, and in particularly the estimative or cogitative power, which is for Aquinas is an internal sense. It's very important in his overall cognitive system, but for our purposes, the main function it does is that it doesn't just sensibly apprehend the external world, it also makes judgments about the value of the external world for the organism. So in particular, the estimative power is judging whether some object is pleasant or painful, or whether it's good for your survival or at odds with your survival. And so the classic example here is that the sheep knows to flee from the wolf. Even a newborn sheep the example says, knows to flee from the wolf. And so the question is, how can the sheep do that? It's not perceiving, there's not some sensible quality of the wolf that's danger. Like the wolf might have a sensible quality of grayness. There's no sensible quality danger that the sheep is taking in by its senses, but the sheep has a sensitive power that on the basis of the information that it's taking in is able to form these judgments. But this is not supposed to be a rational or intellective judgment. It's pre-rational. It is a sense power. So it's kind of like an automatic, intuitive, we might say instinctive judgment that an animal can make, including human animals. And so the most important aspect of the estimative power for the passions is that the estimative power is judging the sensible world as fitting or unfitting, agreeable or disagreeable to the subject. So Aquinas uses the terms conveniens or inconveniens, or sensible good or sensible evil. And that gives the formal object to the passions. And those distinct formal objects made by the estimative power are what distinguish the different passions. So the fundamental distinction, again, is between sensible good and sensible evil, but all of the passions arise from this fundamental distinction. And so you can see on your chart, Aquinas gives 11 general emotions. He thinks that these convey, all the emotions are either contained under these 11 or they might be built out of these 11 basic emotions. So I give this distinct species of the passions, their formal object, and then every kind of appetite is a kind of movement in Aquinas's understanding, either a movement towards, a movement away, or a resting in an object. So I won't go over that in detail, but you can have that on the chart. And then I'll also mention that all of the passions for Aquinas are divided into two subcategories: the concupiscible power of sensitive appetite and the irascible power. And Magda Arnold will make a similar distinction, so I just wanted to point that out here. But next I'll go to Arnold herself. So fast forward about 7 centuries, psychology is in a very different context than it was when St. Thomas was writing. So in the early 1960s, Magda Arnold, who's a psychologist, could speak of emotion as a long neglected field in psychology, and she could comment that psychologists had eliminated the term emotion almost completely from our professional vocabulary. Such neglect was due to the result of a variety of factors. A major one was that behaviorism was the dominant paradigm in psychology. And also there was just the fact that emotion is messy and complex, and psychologists didn't really want to try to deal with it. And it was difficult to deal with in a systematic, scientific way that psychologists wanted to. But Magda Arnold, one of her main goals was to rectify this, to put emotion back on the map for psychologists, and she was largely instrumental in doing precisely that. And she also wanted to come up with an adequate, comprehensive theory of emotion, what emotion is, and its empirical underpinnings. And so in doing this, she laid the foundation again for an entire research program in contemporary psychology called the appraisal tradition, or appraisal theories of emotion. And so her most significant insight and contribution to psychology is usually recognized as the positing of this, what she calls an appraisal process, as central to emotion. And her discovery of this appraisal process begins from 2 observations. The first observation is that emotions, like perceptions, have intentionality, or they have objects. So we don't just feel sadness or feel fear or feel anger. We're sad about something, we're angry at something, or we're sad. I think I said sad. Our emotions have objects. They're about something, about the world. But emotion is different from perception in that, in her words, perception takes in the world as it is in itself, while emotion is a kind of reaction to the world or a relation to the world based on how it affects us. An emotion, she says, there is not only someone who both perception and emotion have an object, but an emotion
the object is known in a particular way. To perceive or apprehend something means that I know what it is like as a thing apart from any effect on me. But to like or dislike it means that I know it not only objectively, as it is apart from me, but also that I estimate its relation to me, that I appraise it as desirable or undesirable, valuable or harmful for me, so that I am drawn toward it or repelled by it. To arouse an emotion, the object must be appraised as affecting me in some way, affecting me personally as an individual with my particular experience and my particular aims. So one of the central arguments that appraisal theorists even to today will use is the fact that the same exact stimulus event or the same exact perception is not going to cause the same emotional reaction in different individuals. And it's also not going to cause the same emotional reaction in the same individual at different times. So to use an example, if you see a grizzly bear at a zoo, you're not going to be terrified. If you see a grizzly bear hiking in the wild, you're going to be very terrified. But you're perceiving one and the same object, a grizzly bear. So there must be some difference going on. It's not a mere mechanical, automatic response. You are in some way appraising the situation, appraising the perception, and you're judging in one case, the grizzly bear is behind a barrier, it can't hurt me. And then the other case, the grizzly bear is right there in front of me and I'm in deep trouble. So she posited this appraisal process. She's actually, again, is very explicit that her inspiration for this appraisal process is Aquinas' estimative power. And you can see on the chart on the back of the page, this chart under section 2, Arnold's appraisal of emotion, is directly from her book. And it's laid out a little bit confusingly, but if you can look at the specific emotions that she lists, they're the exact same as Aquinas' 11 passions, except that she adds one more. So she has 12 and Aquinas has 11. But they're the exact same, and they're basically along the exact same division. So Aquinas has the concupiscible and the irascible. She calls this division impulse emotions and contending emotions. But it's basically the exact same division. So her ultimate definition of emotion, which kickstarts this tradition, is that emotion is defined as the felt tendency toward anything intuitively appraised as good or beneficial, or away from anything intuitively appraised as bad or harmful. This attraction or aversion is accompanied by a pattern of physiological changes organized towards approach or withdrawal. And I think, again, you can clearly pick up on what she's drawing from Aquinas there. She's usually using the language of appetite that Aquinas uses to define the passions. Okay, now I'm going to skip forward a few more decades to more contemporary appraisal theories. This is from a paper that's a review paper of appraisal theories by Moores et al. And they define appraisal theories. They say the basic premise of appraisal theories is that emotions are adaptive responses which reflect appraisals of features of the environment that are significant for the organism's well-being. And then they define the appraisal process itself as a process that detects and assesses the significance of the environment for well-being. Significance for well-being is best conceptualized as the satisfaction or obstruction of concerns. Concerns include the individual's needs, attachments, values, current goals, and beliefs. They include everything that an individual cares about. So I think, again, we can see functional analogy between the contemporary concept of appraisal and Aquinas' estimative power and its function with respect to emotion. But perhaps the most significant development in appraisal theory since Arnold has been the identification of specific appraisal criteria or variables for which the appraisal process produces values which determine the nature of the emotional response. So basically, contemporary appraisal theorists think that appraisal is a mechanism in the brain, and so the brain's taking in all this information from the external world, and it's processing it and assessing that information and producing, and it's doing so according to specific appraisal variables, and then it gives a value for each of those appraisal variables. and the specific values that it gives determine the nature of the emotional response. Contemporary theories also define emotion as a multi-componential process, so it's not a specific thing, it's a combination of distinct components. And the appraisal process triggers processes and multiple organismic subsystems. So this is also from Moores et al. A motivational component with action tendencies or other forms of action readiness. There's a somatic component with a peripheral physiological responses. There's a motor component with expressive and instrumental behavior, and a feeling component with subjective experience or feelings. And these are all adaptational in nature. They're meant to enable us to properly assess, engage, and respond to our environment in reference to our own well-being. Okay, so the standard appraisal variables, there's variation among different theories, but some of the most common ones I give in the chart in section 3. So the most common appraisal variables are goal relevance, goal congruence, certainty, agency, and coping potential or control. So very briefly, I want to go over how these are functionally analogous to the formal objects of Aquinas' passions. So goal relevance is basically just your brain is taking in a huge amount of information, and it needs some way to sort of sift that information and to determine what information is actually relevant to my individual goals as an organism. There's no explicit correlation between this appraisal variable and any of Aquinas' formal objects of the passions, which are given on the chart on the first side of the page. But Aquinas' formal objects pretty much just presuppose goal relevance. Like if your brain, if there's a certain stimulus that affects your brain and your brain takes in information about it, but it judges it not goal relevant, then for Aquinas, the emotion process just isn't going to get kickstarted in the first place. So the appraisal value not goal relevant isn't going to specifically determine any emotion. So all of Aquinas' formal objects of emotion pretty much just presuppose goal relevance. Then there's goal congruence, which is not, the brain is assessing not just whether information is relevant to your goals, but whether it's relevant in a beneficial or a harmful way. And that's very directly correlated in Aquinas, because for Aquinas, the estimative power is forming estimations about whether the external stimulus is good or bad for you, agreeable, disagreeable, stuff like that. So there's a very direct correlation there. Then there's the appraisal variable of certainty, which is just how certain is the outcome of the stimulus. Like, for example, if you come across a grizzly bear in the forest, your brain is taking in this information, and then it needs to form a judgment of how likely is it that the grizzly bear is going to attack? Do I need to run? Do I need to flee? Do I need to drop dead? Anything like that. And there's very direct correlations here again with Aquinas' formal objects. So Aquinas has various possibility conditions in emotions such as hope, despair, fear, and daring. So for example, the formal object of hope he describes as the obtainable future arduous good. So that means that in order to have the passion of hope, your estimative power has to judge that there's some good that's in the future that you are able to obtain. Because if you aren't able to obtain it, there won't be hope, there will be despair. You will despair of obtaining this future good. So again, the estimative power is making judgments about the possibility of obtaining future goods or escaping from evils. Then there's the appraisal variable of agency, which is just the appraisal of who's involved in the situation and what roles they have. I think there's, again, very direct correlation. This is especially apparent in Aquinas' analysis of the passion of anger. So in his analysis, anger is caused by an injury committed to your person by someone else. So in order to feel the passion of anger, you have to judge that someone else has injured you in some way, and then you have to judge that then you feel a desire for vengeance or vengeance upon that injury against yourself. So there is this judgment of agency there as well. And then finally, coping potential is just the appraisal variable which assesses what can you do in a situation? What are the possible outcomes? What are the possible routes you can take for the different outcomes? I think that this is also there's a direct correlate, and I think this is especially seen in, for example, the Aquinas' passion of despair. So you're in despair, you're judging that there's some good that you want, but you're not able to obtain it. So there's some overlap here with other categories like certainty and agency, but I think that there's direct correlation there as well. Let me check my time.
4 minutes.
Okay, so I'm just going to give some very brief considerations, some critical considerations. Like I've gone over some overlap and parallel between Aquinas' theory and contemporary theories. I think a big thing is that Aquinas' account of the passions is situated within his overall metaphysical and anthropological context. So Aquinas is deploying metaphysical categories like form, matter, efficient, formal, final causation, which contemporary psychologists aren't using. And I think that there's a certain danger in contemporary accounts to interpret their accounts in a mechanistic way, which I think can be, this is an area where I think Aquinas can offer some corrective and helpful evaluations of contemporary theories. There's also, I think, and in particular, I think the Aquinas' hylomorphic account of emotion can help contemporary theories explain the unity of emotion. So contemporary theories usually define emotion as just kind of a loose organization of all these distinct processes. But whereas Aquinas' account has a very insightful way to explain these as an overall unity, namely a unity of form and matter. So you have the active appetition, which for Aquinas is the form of emotion, and then you have all the various bodily changes, which are the matter of emotion. And that explains how emotion can involve these distinct components, but is an overall unified process and phenomenon as well. Some questions I have for future consideration and research is, to what extent Aquinas' classification and taxonomy of the passions and their formal objects is sufficient and exhaustive? Is this an area where contemporary psychology, and in particular their empirical research, can identify maybe different emotions that are basic emotions, maybe some of Aquinas' emotions aren't fundamental or basic, maybe they're composed out of more fundamental or basic emotions. So that's an area where I think contemporary psychology and contemporary empirical research could offer clarification to Aquinas' account. There's a lot more to say, but I'll end it there. So, thank you.
We do have 1 minute, so if someone wants to ask a question, you can respond. We get 35 seconds on this.
I do think that's really important, and another thing I didn't mention that is in Aquinas that's not explicit in contemporary accounts is Aquinas very much wants to differentiate the passions, which are in the sensitive appetite, from the will, which is in the intellective appetite, and which follows reason. And it's very important to his overall moral psychology that the passions be subordinated to reason and to the will, whereas contemporary psychologists aren't making that distinction. And so I think Aquinas' account has a much richer insight for moral psychology in determining how the emotions fit into our moral lives. That's, I don't think, present, at least not as explicitly or richly in contemporary psychology.
Thank you. Thank you, Our next speaker is Father Reed Frey, a priest of the Oratory of St. Philip in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, currently a doctoral student in systematic theology at the University of Notre Dame. His paper is entitled Sins of Weakness and Contemporary Psychology. Father Reed.
I have a handout with the main sources I'll use from St. Thomas. I don't cite many of the psychological sources, so if you want those, you can email me. St. Paul describes a common human experience in uncommonly poetic terms. What I do not understand, for I do not do what I want, but I do what I hate. St. Thomas takes up this problem and frames it within a larger discussion of the sources of sin, which is in turn framed within his larger anthropology. St. Thomas's treatment of sins of weakness in particular can be given some additional color by contemporary psychological insights drawn from empirical and counseling psychology. Yet contemporary psychology does not make St. Thomas's more classical treatment irrelevant. On the contrary, the confusions in contemporary psychology surrounding categories of sin, moral wrongdoing, freedom, and habit are often so great as to lead to a gross distortion of the human being. Thus, the framework of a proper anthropology and fundamental moral philosophy and theology is required to properly contextualize and capitalize on the insights given by contemporary psychological literature. St. Thomas's analysis of sins of weakness is therefore used here to structure an investigation concerning sins of weakness that draws together some of the most helpful features of both Thomistic moral theology and contemporary psychological insights. As such, this paper charts a course for a richer account of sins of weakness than either contemporary psychology or St. Thomas's thinking alone can offer. Generically speaking, this paper takes the sin of weakness to occur in the following case, which I take to be a faithful reading of St. Thomas. 3 necessary and sufficient conditions. 1, some human person habitually knows some sinful act X to be a sin. 2, the same human person habitually intends to do the good and to not do sinful act X. And 3, the person nevertheless does sinful act X. I'm going to speak today specifically about sexual sin, not only because it's St. Thomas's favorite example in both the De Malo and the Summa, but also because it's a particularly pressing problem for human beings and for Christians. Here, I could have perhaps delivered about the weakness with buying books. I made a resolution not to go into the bookselling room, knowing I wasn't strong enough to resist. Then a guy who I thought was becoming my friend convinced me to go inside, and I walked out having spent money on books. So I perhaps could have done that, but for this purpose, we're going to focus on sexual sins of weakness, which means, number 1, some human person habitually knows an unchaste act to be a sin. 2, the same person habitually intends to do the good and to not commit any unchaste acts. And 3, the person nevertheless commits an unchaste act. Sins of weakness alone meet the 3 above detailed requirements, and thus are distinct in St. Thomas's picture from sins of both malice and ignorance. Sins of weaknesses are instances where the unchaste act is incongruous with the person's settled way of being and from how the person habitually thinks they ought to conduct themselves. For St. Thomas, such cases are these as are best understood in terms of weakness of soul that can be likened to the weakness of the body. Somebody is bodily weak when their body cannot do that which it ought, such that the old man cannot get out of bed due to his frailty, even when he desires to do so. Analogously, the soul is weak when it is hindered in the execution of its proper action due to disorder in its parts. When the irascible or concupiscible parts of the soul are affected by any passion contrary to the reason, disorder in the parts of the soul arises and weakness ensues, leading somebody to do the sort of thing that they habitually intend to avoid and they habitually know is wrong. St. Thomas explains how this weakness occurs through the use of the practical syllogism. For St. Thomas, reason directs human acts through a twofold knowledge of the universal and the particular. In conferring about what ought to be done, the reason employs a syllogism, St. Thomas thinks, which concludes with an act of judgment or operation about what ought to be done. These concluding judgments always pertain to singulars, what ought to be done in this particular case. The concluding judgment must therefore be the result of both a universal proposition and a particular proposition. Thus, as St. Thomas states, a man is restrained from an act of parricide by the knowledge, 1, that it is wrong to kill one's father, and 2, that this man is his father, and therefore he ought not kill this man. In the De Malo, St. Thomas's choice of the practical syllogism as sins of weakness is fornication, which seems to be his favorite example, and it runs as follows. Premise 1, no fornication should be committed. Premise 2, this act would be fornication. Conclusion, therefore I should not do it. Pretty straightforward. As such, this person would not commit the act of fornication. However, in the sin of weakness, St. Thomas thinks that this practical syllogism does not have the decision-making impact that it otherwise would have. This otherwise act-shaping syllogism can be rendered ineffective by not being actually known at the time of choice, meaning that it's not immediately held in the person's intellect at the time the decision is made. The syllogism can still be known habitually, meaning that it resides in the intellect in a stable manner, but is not presently being accessed or drawn upon. For example, all of you know habitually where you attended elementary school, but you were not thinking of it actually until I just brought it up. At the moment of choice, whether to fornicate or not, some given person can still habitually know that fornication is wrong, but does not actually know it at the moment they decide to fornicate. The practical syllogism can also be rendered ineffective on account of a failure to recognize the second premise, namely a failure to recognize the particular instance of a generic thing. In some measure, this can be attributed to the unique character of persons and the unique character of sexual morality. As the Eddie Cantor song from 1926 argues, fornication can be justified in this sense because, quote, if you knew Susie like I know Susie, in Shakespeare words, she's a wow and nobody knows her but me. Somehow the person in front of you does not appeal to the generic case of a woman who is not one's wife and therefore one should not have sex with them. In either instance of syllogism A, the syllogism of reason being rendered ineffective, an alternative syllogism might be effective. St. Thomas alludes to this in the Summa and adds more color to it in the De Malo. This practical syllogism finds its origin in the passions, but being a syllogism, of course, it resides in the intellect. So when he talks about the syllogism of concupiscence or the syllogism of the passions, he, of course, realizes this is residing in the intellect. On this syllogism, premise 1 is that all pleasurable acts should be enjoyed. Premise 2 is this act will be a pleasurable act, and therefore I should do it. Following practical syllogism B, it would seem that our person facing Susie would end up fornicating. Anscombe here might object that only someone seriously deranged would ever hold this syllogism. After all, who thinks everything pleasurable should really be pursued? One cannot simply pursue all pleasurable acts, and further, many pleasurable acts seem to be mutually exclusive. One might find the pleasurable consumption of a dozen chocolate chip cookies to be motivating, and similarly find pleasurable the experience of not feeling sick to one's stomach for eating the cookies. Even the vicious man is not likely to pursue all pleasure. The intemperate man, for example, is not apt to pursue pleasurable adultery if he is likely to die for it. And there's a further problem here. If one removes all from the major premise, as St. Thomas does in one formulation in the De Malo, one no longer has a logically necessary syllogism. Yet this is a problem that St. Thomas seems to recognize and he seems to be comfortable with in the treatise on human acts, and we can talk about that more in detail if you'd like. So, St. Thomas thinks there's 3 ways that practical syllogism A is not rendered effective and practical syllogism B is rendered effective. In other words, the person does the thing. The first is the case of opposition. In opposition, a passion inclines someone contrary to what they know in general, and the person is essentially moved by concupiscence, such that the universal proposition is still known habitually, but not known actually. In other words, the universal knowledge that fornication is wrong is still present in the intellect, but the knowledge that pertains to the particular is not known. As such, our example case here, John, who's in love with Susie, cannot identify that this act with this somebody to whom he is married constitutes fornication. To whom he's not married, sorry. Therefore, practical syllogism A is rendered ineffective because it is incomplete, and practical syllogism B governs John's actions. Recall that St. Thomas thinks judgments pertaining to operations are only effective when they pertain to a particular case. Having a universal proposition about fornication being wrong is itself inadequate. It must be coupled with the proposition that this particular state of affairs is warranting of the syllogism A. Importantly, St. Thomas protects himself from a plausible experiential objection. The objection, whether it's really true that somebody wouldn't know that this act of fornication is a sin and should not be committed. However, St. Thomas says, one can imagine asking the soon-to-be fornicator if fornication is a sin, and they correctly answer yes. However, St. Thomas says that this is a case of outwardly saying this should be shunned, while internally judging that it ought to be done according to practical syllogism B. In other words, it's thinking one thing externally and internally. It's stating something, but not really believing it inside. Now, this understanding can be enhanced by the contemporary understanding of dissociation and depersonalization. Opposition, this case that we're talking about, is characterized by the minor premise not being actually known at the time of the sin. So the syllogism of the passions is rendered effective. Dissociative disorders are numerous, but for our purposes, depersonalization is the most important. As understood by the American Psychiatric Association, depersonalization is the experiences of unreality, detachment, or being an outside observer with respect to one's thoughts, feelings, sensations, body, or actions. For example, perceptual alterations, a distorted sense of time, unreal or absent self, emotional or physical numbing. Dissociative disorders are characterized by a disruption in the normal integration of consciousness, memory, identity, emotion, perception, and behavior, and are frequently found in the aftermath of a wide variety of psychologically traumatic experiences in children, adolescents, and adults. And in the sexual domain, there is no shortage of traumas affecting the general population. Contemporary evidence suggests that trauma decreases one's ability to exercise proper executive function. Childhood trauma predicts this executive dysfunction even long into adulthood and long after the trauma has occurred. Sexual trauma survivors also exhibit significantly higher rates of sexual discounting, which is basically the inability to delay gratification, making it more likely for them to engage in risky sexual behaviors and generally commit ill-conceived sexual mistakes. Now, the DSM states that this dissociation arising from trauma can disrupt every aspect of psychological functioning. An individual with depersonalization can feel detached from his or her entire being, or subjectively detached from sub-aspects of the being, including feelings or thoughts. There can also be a diminished sense of agency, with the DSM describing people feel robotic, like an automaton, they lack control of speech or even movements. Dissociation leads to a variety of strange disconnections from reality. The Cambridge Depersonalization Scale, which is a clinical instrument, diagnostic instrument used to measure the level of depersonalization that occurs in a given subject, states that respondents answer that they feel cut off from this world. They feel as if parts of my body don't belong to me. Whilst doing something, they have the feeling of being a detached observer of themselves, or perhaps most strikingly, I feel so detached from my thoughts that they seem to have a life of their own. I think that this account of depersonalization provides clinical evidence for what St. Thomas thinks is going on in that people shun things interiorly despite knowing them exteriorly. There's a real dissociation and separation between some aspect of the person and the two syllogisms. A variety of clinical findings indicate that cognitive abilities stay intact, but there's a particular bias to avoid the cognitive processing of emotional material, which of course becomes all the more understandable if we accept the trauma point. While most people do not have a full-blown grade of a clinical dissociative disorder, the DSM itself states that transient depersonalization lasting hours to days are common in the general population. Two authors argue that it is the third most common psychiatric symptom occurring in the general population, and one commentator identifies dissociation as the key core experience that inhibits people from their from progressing in their struggle with unwanted sexual behavior. For this thinker, dissociation describes disconnecting from full engagement with your body and the relationships around you. The second mode of the failure of the syllogism A that St. Thomas describes is distraction. St. Thomas argues that the powers of the soul are in competition with each other and that there's a finite amount of energy in each person's soul. This soul energy or psychic energy is competitive, such that one power of the soul is intent on its act and drawing a disproportionate amount of psychic energy, and therefore that psychic energy cannot be available for other parts of the soul. They become remiss or altogether impeded. In the De Malo, St. Thomas further elaborates that it is evident that whenever a person has a power intent on its act, another power is hindered or completely turned away from its act. For example, if one is expending his energy on completing a 100-meter sprint via his locomotive power, he may find he is unable to simultaneously solve complicated calculus problems with his reasoning power. So too, his nutritive power will slow while he's running his 100-meter sprint, and presumably his reproductive power will be altogether impeded. With respect to our inquiry on the possible act of fornication, it seems that in the instance of distraction, St. Thomas thinks that the person's carnal passions are so strong that the passions are drawing all of the soul's energy, such that the reason has no energy left to draw. And thus, the person fails to actually know the practical syllogism A, and practical syllogism B, which has the support of the passions, is able to draw more energy and thus become the effective and act-shaping syllogism. In the case of distraction, the power of the soul is intent on its act, but another thing is drawing a disproportionate amount of the psychic energy that needs to be available to the act. Contemporary psychology helps us to understand why the sexual faculty would draw so much energy towards itself, especially in the passions, such that the person fails to have the energy to properly hold the syllogism of reason in their intellect. One does not consider actually what one knows habitually and instead zooms in on some other particular judgment. Now, if only the practical syllogism of reason was known at the moment of the fall, one would avoid the sin. But here, trauma and dissociation make this actual knowing more difficult and grant an additional level of plausibility to St. Thomas's account. In the most extreme case, one cannot see their thoughts as their thoughts, and they're distanced from them because the passions are drawing all the energy. Those thoughts seem distant, cut off. As the Cambridge metric describes, I feel so detached from my thoughts that they have a life of their own. The syllogism of reason could really be just a thought. The syllogism of concupiscence, on the other hand, is being fueled by the passions and a passionate desire to go back to the places of trauma and difficulty. The craving for this experience explains why the passions are so strong that they can overpower the reason, which is hardly convicted of its own syllogism to begin with. Third, bodily transmutation. Here, St. Thomas thinks the reason is fettered by some somatic change and thus cannot actualize practical syllogism A and instead is animated by practical syllogism B. This bodily transmutation can come about either as a result of the passions themselves or as a result of some other bodily malady unrelated to the passions that still prevents somebody from carrying out their task. In bodily transmutation, the reason is fettered by some change in the body such that one has gone out of their mind. I think this view is enhanced by what we know now about the shaping of one's brain due to pornography exposure and the effect of trauma on one's brain. We have learned that pornography actually changes the physiology of one's brain. A recent and substantial study, which has N of 1,300 in the Journal of Sex Research, states that 91.5% of men and 60.2% of women admit to using pornography in the last month. Exposure to such material has been linked to, quote, specific subjective, autonomous, behavioral, and neural responses, changing the way one's cognitive processes work. Recent research suggests a strong connection between exposure to sexual imagery and cues that can have an impact on temporal discounting or the ability to delay gratification. The repeated exposure to sexual content has in turn also been linked by contemporary psychology to various kinds of negative behavior changes. And these behaviors find a basis in the body themselves. Over 70 neural imaging studies on the connection between sex and the brain have been performed in recent years, and a number of results include meaningful changes to the structure of the brain. Pornography affects the neurotransmitters and the very structure of the brain and creates cravings that are exceptionally strong at the physiological level. While this cannot be stated for other sexual sins of weakness on the basis of neural imaging, largely because there's no research on it, it's clear that, at least with respect to pornography, the bodily transmutation described by St. Thomas resonates with the neural imaging findings of habitual pornography use. Trauma also affects the physiology of one's brain, and since the 1990s, we've been able to see consistent patterns in trauma patients' brains when their traumas are re-triggered. We can see that the limbic system and the amygdala, the part of the brain which warns of the impending danger and activates the body's stress responses, amplify. And on the other hand, the parts of the brain associated with putting one's thoughts and feelings into words, associating cause and effect, grasping the long-term effects of our actions, and creating future plans completely shut down in a way very similar to strokes. Other areas of the brain that are linked to linguistic, sequential, or analytical function is deactivated. And these changes fuel depersonalization that we talked about earlier so dramatically that you can actually deliver a mild electric current to the temporal parietal junction in the brain and stimulate the same effect. The presence of trauma causes these changes in the body, and when trauma is re-triggered, a person experiences a severe bodily transmutation that shuts down certain parts of the brain associated with reason, reflection, and analysis, and triggers dramatic physiological and emotional reactions. These powerful instances of bodily transmutation lend further credence to St. Thomas's claim that bodily changes can serve as a fuel for sexual sins of weakness, since they inflame the emotional centers of the brain and hamper the analytic and decision-making parts of the traumatized brain. Thank you.
We have about 8 minutes for questions.
Father.
I was just wondering, in terms of your practical syllogism B, whether there's also a sort of mirror image about avoiding pain or discomfort. So it might be that I'm feeling something physically or emotionally that I don't want to, and that could be at the front of my mind in seeking something that might be wrong, but it does, in the person's mind, seem to be, okay, I'm just avoiding evil, I'm avoiding this pain or this difficulty.
Like the craving, for example.
The craving, or like some kind of self-medicating. You might eat to feel better or something.
Yeah. So as far as I see it, that's not St. Thomas's account, but it seems perfectly reasonable to me, and maybe could even further strengthen his account, that there's a third syllogism going on there about the avoidance of pain. So that's a great insight, I think. Thank you. Yeah, I'm gonna write that down. Yeah.
If you take into consideration the counsel as an operation of moral deliberation, of the process of moral reasoning, there can be many syllogisms at work that arrive at possible actions, which necessarily or likely include, either implicitly or explicitly, if it's a prohibition of one thing, I should not do this, it's perhaps going to include the positive command, I ought to do this other thing. That's the opposite, or vice versa. So that if you are thinking of the adultery as something desirable, you also have an aversion to avoiding it. So he speaks of it in terms of love of God. You don't love God if you know that doing so would involve having to give up this thing that's prohibited. So because that's coupled with the love of God. So every positive commandment could have associated with the corresponding negative version of it that goes along. But we might need to look at question 15 of the Three Parts, where he takes up the topic of consent. And there he just speaks about it positively. We only choose that to which we consent. But there are any number of things which we might deliberate about, come to a practical conclusion, and that's present in our mind. But for what he says, the reason of the human motion of the will, don't consent to. So it could be that someone knows that they have that this act they're contemplating is prohibited. That, and in doing so, it just falls out of the running for the objects of choice. And that might be a way of accounting Thomas for disassociation. He's not using those terms, obviously. But it's there, yet your inclination to the good that would be prohibited by that conclusion is so strong that it just literally, you don't feel it. You don't consent to it. And again, his explanation of it is very brief, and he doesn't deal with it much elsewhere. But that could be an instance where you do have a positive precept, I should not, or a positive or a negative precept, I should not do this, but you just ignore it.
Yeah, I don't know that St. Thomas would classify that. I mean, I'm happy to look at this question. I don't have it in my head at the moment. It doesn't seem to me, at first glance, that St. Thomas would want to classify that as a sin of weakness. He would want to classify that as a sin of the will. So even you're talking about consent. I mean, he's pretty explicit as far as I read him that when it's consent in this sense, then it's properly qualified under a sin of malice rather than a sin of weakness. Maybe one that's excusable, maybe one that's explainable, maybe one that we can have a lot of compassion on. But nevertheless, under the rubric of malice rather than weakness, as far as I read him. But I'm happy to look at that question.
The weakness of the will, but it not being so, its direction being not strong toward that particular precept that concludes.
Yeah, of course. I mean, ultimately, for something to be a sin, St. Thomas is clear, the will has to be involved. Otherwise, it's not a sin at all. Right. So, yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
My question revolves on, given these three modes, what role does culpability on the individual play? Even if they have these impediments, and second, what that culpability is I'm thinking of a case if someone just walks out of the confessional after confessing their individual sins, and then they're presented with an occasion, a temptation, barring that they don't have any medical or physiological thing with a drug addiction, or they might have really bad withdrawals or something, but something of a different nature, what's in their power to still not fall into that sin, even though they're in the throes of this habit of this sin of weakness?
Yeah, I mean, St. Thomas is pretty dramatic in his giving of exculpation with sins of weakness. He says that depending on how strong these things are, the person is not to be condemned, but even pitied for how weak of soul they are. So he's pretty quick to excuse. But as far as I read St. Thomas, the metric of sins of weakness always proximately has to involve the will. And so it can be a kind of sin, but not in the strict sense, right? Because in the strict sense, a sin always has to involve the will. So yeah, I think he would have a lot of compassion on such a case. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Great.
Our final speaker is Dr. Andrew Kim, Associate Professor of Theology at Marquette University, where he specializes in moral theology.
Thank you. So I wrote my dissertation 13 or 14 years ago now on the topic of the unity of the virtues, Aquinas' thesis in particular. And what I was interested in mainly there, and I'm still interested in, is accounts of sanctification. What is sanctification? In particular, Aquinas' claim that it kind of requires the virtues being of a piece and coming together, and that view, of course, is objected to largely by contemporary ethicists. So I was trying to kind of figure that out in my dissertation and have still been working through it. Since that time, I also became interested in the theology of addiction and recovery. So that kind of complicated the picture also, like how addiction connects to sanctification and kind of those kind of questions about addiction thought of as a moral issue versus a disease and all of that. And then the kind of theology, psychology frontier of what psychology adds when we think about sanctification. So all of that kind of comes together in what I've written here. So here goes. I divide this essay into 3 parts. The first part gives a brief overview of Aquinas' thesis that true virtues form a unity. In particular, I lay out objections to Aquinas' thesis that are difficult to respond to, while also highlighting problems that emerge were one to simply discard the thesis in favor of an isolation thesis of virtue. The second part gives a brief overview of the psychological anthropology proposed by internal family systems therapy, which I call IFS hereafter. And the third and final part demonstrate ways that IFS, or at least its underlying psychological anthropology, insofar as it's surprisingly consistent with Scripture, at least in some ways, can help us think about the unity of the virtues in a way that preserves what's most valuable in the thesis, while perhaps offering a more realistic response to the main objections to that thesis. And I draw from Porter's famous article about Martin Luther King and all that, and doing that. Put concisely, my argument is that joining a biblical account of the unity of the virtues and pluralistic personality helps preserve 4 important realities. These things that I think are important realities or are true. First, true virtue must align with that which is truly good. Second, the virtues form a unity. Third, the same person can possess virtue and habitually sin in the same span of time, and I mean their serious sin, not just minor sin or venial sin in the Catholic tradition. And fourth, psychological ailment and moral failing are not always coextensive. The latter point, however, is not a concession to the overly optimistic IFS anthropology regarding human sinfulness, which I'll lay out in a little bit. So first, objections and replies to the unity thesis. I turn now to Aquinas' thesis that the virtues form a unity, which is an idea by no means original to him. Socrates is generally acknowledged as the author and originator of the view that the virtues are unified, but that's a little bit misleading since for him there's only one virtue, wisdom, which is correct knowledge of good and evil. Justice, temperance, courage, or whatever else are simply manifestations of wisdom in different contexts. For Socrates, with Plato and Aristotle, however, we end up with the classical schema of truly discrete cardinal virtues forming a unity or enjoying a reciprocity of phronesis and the moral virtues and so forth. Nonetheless, wisdom or phronesis remain primary and the charioteer or mother or root of the virtues in those systems. The identification of virtue with wisdom is relevant to this essay since it preserves what I take to be the most important aspect of the unity thesis, namely that virtue is a fine and noble thing, since it aligns with actual, real, objective moral reality. This was, of course, Socrates' famous response to Protagoras. Virtues are not merely habits that make a person effective at whatever pursuits they happen to fancy, but rather qualities that make them truly good and able to act in a manner that is truly good with ease, constancy, and pleasure. Thus, the quote-unquote courage of the Nazi or bank robber, terrorist, or whatever else is discounted to the dismay of Protagoras and all of the objectors to the thesis throughout the centuries. True courage is shaped by prudence and aligns with a truthful vision of how things are. Virtues are excellences of character, not mere efficiencies. Although Augustine and Aquinas place love atop the hierarchy of virtues, both understand and uphold the vital role of attaining wisdom and becoming good. The problem that emerges, however, involves how to reconcile the attainment of virtue with the ongoing presence of sin in the life of the faithful. Whereas the classical philosophers, and especially the Stoics, could envision the sage complete in his wisdom and now more or less impervious to error, the theologians knew better. Augustine and Aquinas were aware of the seriousness of ongoing struggle with sin, even in the life of the virtuous person, and both responded to this problem by upholding a vision of virtue as consisting in degrees and existing side by side, as it were, with regular moral failings. I don't believe, however, that the account offered by Augustine and Aquinas sufficiently accounts for the bewildering complexity of actual human beings, who, as we all know to be true, can be some measure of virtuous in one domain, while simultaneously beleaguered by some habitual sin in another, who can imagine themselves to have entirely overcome some area of sin in their lives only to relapse into it in an instant at the slightest provocation as though no progress had been made whatever, whose desires can go the right length for the better part of several months only to become wildly defective or excessive thereafter, who can be just to certain persons in their life while horrifically unjust to others during the same period of time, who can be movingly altruistic at one moment and basely selfish the next. I could go on like this, but I suppose everyone here understands the point I'm making. Indeed, Scripture seems at points to envision the moral life as a struggle between rival personalities existing within the same person. Holy Scripture portrays this rivalry as between the old and new self. In his letter to the church in Ephesus, for instance, Paul exhorts believers to, quote, put off concerning your former conduct the old man, which grows corrupt according to deceitful lusts, and be renewed in the spirit of your mind, and that you put on the new man, which was created according to God in true righteousness and holiness, end quote. And yet we know that this transformation from old self to new self is not a clean break, as it were. Since this is the same Paul who confesses in his letter to the Romans that he does the things he hates, does not do the good he wishes he would, here Paul contrasts his redeemed self with, quote, sin that dwells in him, end quote. We find something of the same problem in the first epistle of John. We're told that anyone who says, quote, I know Christ and does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him, end quote. But we are also told a moment before that, quote, if we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us, end quote. We're told also of darkness that is passing away and true light already shining. Clearly, John is not envisioning a group of entirely sanctified believers keeping Christ's command perfectly, or perhaps he's thinking of keeping his command as, quote, walking in the light, which means acknowledging the ongoing sinfulness even of those walking in the light. To walk in the light does not mean no longer sinning, but rather confessing one's sinfulness, receiving forgiveness, bringing one's sin into the light where it can be cleansed, as it were. The ongoing presence of sin in the life of the believer poses a major problem for the thesis that the virtues form a unity. Technically, at issue here is a subset of the unity thesis referred to as the exclusionary thesis. The thesis, that is, that virtue and vice cannot coexist in the same person at the same moment, since one is the perfection and the other the corruption of a power or capacity of the soul. One's muscle cannot, of course, simultaneously have reached the upper limit of its capacity and be atrophied. However, I don't draw a sharp line between the exclusionary and unity thesis, as I view them to be two sides of the same coin. The focus of the unity thesis is the interrelation of perfected powers needed to consistently do the good, whereas the exclusionary thesis simply submits that should any of those powers be impotent or malformed, then progress in the good will be drastically impeded. At any rate, the problem we're left with is that it does seem right to say that virtues, in order to be true virtues, must rely on one another. How can one train one's desires to go the right length if he cannot discern what the right length is? How can one attack or endure injustice if unable to discern between what is just and unjust? How can one discern the good if overwhelmed by desires or fears that distort his vision of reality, leading him to self-deception about the content and motivation of even his very own actions? It does seem that the habitus of all the virtues are needed to act well with constancy, ease, and pleasure. At the same time, it's hard to respond to the objector's common sense point of view that the actual reality of people is much more of a mixed bag. We simply can't find these fully virtuous people in real life. In the written record of humanity, we have only one account of such a person, Jesus of Nazareth. Even the people we find who do seem to have a high measure of virtue in some area can fall woefully short in other areas. We are then left with the problem that true virtue must be of a piece, but that no one seems to possess virtue so described. Even the most virtuous humans have serious, not trivial moral flaws that are ongoing, intermittent, or persistent. Adherents of the unity thesis simply don't have a good response to this problem, but detractors have not been able to offer a convincing retort to the thesis either. A pluralistic account of personality may be able to help us think about the problem in a different way. That's my second section on the psychological anthropology of IFS. One of the things that interests me about IFS is the way it came about. As a therapist, Richard Schwartz, who are in the 60s, 70s here, simply observed that people tend to think and speak about themselves as having personalities comprised of different parts, almost more like a community than a solitary individual. One can observe this even in everyday, God bless you, everyday speech when one says, well, a part of me wants to do X, but another part of me wants to do Y, and so forth. On this basis, Schwartz proposed a concept of personality as pluralistic. Put another way, our personalities are shaped not merely by exterior relationships, but also internal ones. Parts of ourselves trying and often failing to get along with one another. The Disney series Inside Out, which I haven't seen, seems to have picked up on this. It's not just that sadness is sad, rather sadness has its own way of seeing the world, rationality, motivations, and so forth, like a person. IFS locates three main personalities that most of us carry: the exile, the firefighter, and the manager. The exile is the vulnerable part, almost like an inner child that's been wounded, rejected, abandoned, ridiculed, and in whatever way made to feel unworthy of attentive love. The philosopher Vidal calls attentive love. The manager then is a kind of protector figure who emerges to try and ward off or prevent any event that might activate the terrifying feelings and vulnerability of the exile. So the manager is constantly trying to arrange one's day so as to prevent any feelings of rejection or unworthiness. The firefighter comes into play when the manager fails. He, quote unquote, puts out the emotional fire caused by whatever event has slipped through the manager's closely monitored cracks and triggered the exile. One can see here the connection to addiction, as destructive substances or behaviors are often the firefighter's medicines of choice, the self-medicating you kind of mentioned earlier. Having a personality or personalities divided in this way is perfectly common. According to IFS adherents, it's not a pathology, it's kind of how people are. It's distinct from dissociative identity disorder, but it's just kind of how people are. Recovery, healing, growth, or whatever one wants to call it, takes place when the quote-unquote core leader gains control of the sort of boardroom of the soul. The core leader is compassionate, curious, clear, creative, calm, confident, courageous, and connected. Those are called the 8 C's. This is why I called IFS Anthropology a little optimistic. He leads not in a domineering way, but by conversing with the other parts, understanding their stories and why they're there, and setting them to new tasks. Indeed, a key conviction of IFS Anthropology is that people aren't bad. There are no bad parts. The parts that cause trouble are simply trying to help and not doing a very good job. Parts can carry burdens, but are not sinful. Much of IFS, then, is about improving communication and understanding amongst the parts and learning how to lead the community of self through the various struggles of life so as to release burdened parts and free them to more productive tasks. We arrive here at a frontier problem between theology and psychology. Put simply, perhaps too simply, is that sin resides in what C.S. Lewis called the central person, what Scripture calls the innermost self, and is distinct from diseases or abnormalities in the psychological outfit. The one requires repentance, the other healing. The problem occurs when we conflate the two or discern wrongly. Sometimes moral failing and psychological disease are present in the same event, sometimes one or the other, and so forth. But I do believe that we need both categories in order to avoid constantly erring in one direction or the other, and IFS does not, as far as I can tell, have the resources to account for moral failing or parts of us that, to draw from Paul, simply need to be killed when we put on the new self. So, to be clear, I'm not suggesting that IFS must be wholesale accepted or rejected by a Christian. Those aspects of it consistent with, or at least not contradictory to Scripture, may be utilized and helpful, whereas the rest must be rejected. I think that in a very broad sense, the pluralistic account of personality posited by FS is consistent with Scripture, perhaps even more so than the merely metaphysical anthropologies of the kinds posited by the scholastics. However, the no bad parts business obviously doesn't work. Even if they were to go further and posit bad parts, we would still have to attribute moral responsibility to the person conceived of as a singularity, as Augustine did against the Manichaeans. IFS can, however, potentially aid our understanding if brought under the authority of Scripture. To illustrate, let's turn to the famous case of Martin Luther King Jr. This is my final concluding section. Members of this audience are likely familiar with Jean Porter's famous article, drawing from the moral struggles of Martin Luther King Jr. to demonstrate that the unity of the virtues is false. I wrote about that article 10-some years ago, and I was kind of trying to respond, arguing against Porter. And then a couple of years ago, she came to Marquette for the Père Marquette dinner, and I was seated next to her at the dinner. I was so excited to hear how she was going to respond to my argument. So I asked her about it, and she said, "Oh, I changed my mind on that years ago." So disappointed. Anyway, that's an aside. Okay. King, of course, is best known for the virtues he displayed in morally confronting segregation, a cause which ultimately cost him his life. Less well known, perhaps, is his repeated marital infidelity, which suggests, in the very least, a severe lack of temperance, but also really courage, stand against temptation, justice towards his wife, etc. Even prudence, listening to the wrong syllogism and so forth. So we don't want to deny him virtue entirely, as Porter thinks the unity thesis requires us to do, right? Porter thinks that such a move is obviously wrong and even absurd, meaning that we simply have to acknowledge that true virtue and serious vice can, bewildering as it may be, exist side by side in the same person at the same time. I don't find attempts to refute Porter on this point, including my own, very convincing. They basically involve pointing out that virtue can consist in degrees, and that upholders of the unity thesis like Aquinas were well aware of that. And yet, although isolation thesis folks can poke holes in the unity thesis easily enough, they really don't have much of a theory of their own. For how can a person possess a virtue in full in one area and then seemingly lack the same virtue in another? Like, what's that about? I'm thinking here of folks like N.K. Badwar and his thesis of limited domain separability, or whatever he calls it. Alistair McIntyre with the courageous Nazi example he gives in After Virtue. Robert Merrihew Adams with his idea of modules of virtue and settings. I don't find those accounts very convincing either. Maybe Scripture can offer a better account. Presupposing the presence of saving faith in the life of King, then, his new regenerate self would possess the virtue virtuti simpliciter, which would continue to grow as he progressed along his path of sanctification, but would still need to endure, at least for a time, being joined to the old self with its temptations and lusts that conceive and give birth to sin and death. I'm drawing from James there and noticing how Scripture, going back to Genesis, does seem to often present sin as a kind of entity that's conceived within a person, like it's its own being with its own thoughts, feelings, motivations, desires, and so forth. So you may be asking, what need have we of IFS? Well, perhaps sex addiction was King's firefighter's way of coping with his own feelings of worthlessness. While believers cannot deny the sinful element of this, it can, by God's grace, help us see how our exiles are triggered when our ego ideals are challenged in a way that invites humility. And in other instances where psychological disease has utterly superseded decision-making or non-sinful behaviors are involved, IFS may help persons reach a more normal psychological state, which of course tells us nothing about the degree to which they'll go on sinning. In this way, we preserve 4 important realities. First, true virtue must align with that which is truly good. Second, the virtues form a unity. Third, the same person can possess virtue and habitually sin in the same span of time. Again, that involves serious sinning, not just venial sins. And fourth, psychological ailment and moral failing are not coextensive. In the final analysis, the best defense of the unity thesis might simply be the positing of rival selves, as Scripture seems to support. IFS, while emerging in the 60s and 70s, may, despite itself, be reaching back to a much more ancient way of thinking about the quote-unquote self. And yet, as Christians, we must confess that the compassionate, curious, clear, creative, calm, confident, courageous, and connected leader IFS posits as our true core self is really only the new self God brings to life when he brings the sinner out of death and sin and transgressions. We must acknowledge also that not only are there bad parts, there aren't really any good ones that we can call exclusively our own. Whatever goodness or whatever part is God's gift to us, whatever goodness of whatever part is God's gift to us, not our gift to him. Our core leader or central person or innermost self or whatever will find himself finally for the first time on firm footing only when he submits to the Good Shepherd.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. Questions? We have a good amount of time.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. So one question I have, and I'm not super familiar with this literature, and I'm assuming that this is addressed, but like Aristotle and St. Thomas distinguished between what they call natural virtues and like true virtue. And so the natural virtues are just kind of like natural dispositions you might have to happen to operate in a virtuous way. So you might have someone who has natural courage, and that just means that they are kind of naturally disposed to not, to overcome their fears of certain things. But it's not true moral virtue unless it's, you have to have phronesis and unity of all the virtues. So why not just say with someone such as King, who in one area of his life demonstrates what seems like remarkable courage or remarkable virtue, but in other areas doesn't, why not say that that's because he has this natural virtue, but he doesn't have the true unity? It's not true virtue because there's not all the virtues together.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think that probably the most straightforward answer is just because people would not find that satisfying to like devote his virtue that way. I mean, at the end of the day, there's not really like an empirical test we can do to say, okay, it's level 7 of this virtue, right? Like not Scientologist or something. So I think it's like, it just came out. In De Virtutis Cardinalis, and then he reiterates it in some of Theology 65:1-2, I think. Like the idea is that those dispositions, I think he says, are wholly imperfect. So like they have like appearances of virtue, kind of, but technically calling them a virtue, calling them even a virtue, is questionable at best because they're dispositions and they can incline any way, and like it seems like, and then he gives us in De Virtutis the second level, which as you say is joined to reason, the Virtutis Simpliciter. So one problem would be that, claims to be a person of faith, so why not the Virtutis Simpliciter? But then even if you say, okay, well let's just go to reason, it seems like his behavior in morally confronting segregation was pretty consistent, not erratic and all over the place type of thing. So it seems like you'd have an issue there still, like reconciling what appears to be a consistent virtue of justice in one area with a deeply inconsistent practicing of justice in another. That's the best I could do it.
Perhaps in light of Andrew's talk on day 1 with, and Bill Madison on the distinction between habits and dispositions. On this particular case, it'd be hard, I don't know if it'd be hard to tell whether King had good dispositions but vicious habits, or good habits, virtues, and just a disordered disposition in one respect. How would you, does the IRS framework give any guide for distinguishing between those two options?
Help me a little bit with it. Distinguishing between a disposition and what?
Disposition and a genuine habit. Right? So that was Madison's point, the distinction between disposition and habit. And when we have putting on the armor of Christ, putting on the virtues, in that case, I don't know whether they're putting the threefold characters that IFS deals with. Would that be someone who is not necessarily virtuous, but putting on, just to take not to make it the subject matter of our analysis, but as an example, is he acting justly with regard to other people outside of his interpersonal relations, as a kind of putting something on, but really just to either hide from himself or preserve the ability to act according to that disordered disposition or habit? Again, I don't know whether it would be a habit or just a disposition as Madison defines it.
Yeah, I don't know that IFS really gives us tools to talk about habit or disposition. I think typically in terms of like rival personalities or rival motivations, or that are in a kind of fight amongst themselves.
So they're abiding in a sense.
They're what?
They are abiding personalities. So they would be pre-existing inclinations to certain kinds of actions or against certain kinds of actions, I guess. So they have qualities that you enumerate for each of them.
Yeah, they have qualities, and it would be like, again, so one of the major problems I was trying to highlight in the paper with IFS is that it doesn't have a hamartiology. It doesn't really have a concept of sin. There's no bad parts, and they don't even see the kind of divide itself as mythology. That's kind of how people are. So it's sort of, even like a medical model, it doesn't really make a strong distinction between like normative claims. So I think the best it could do is something like, well, there's this part of Martin Luther King, probably, if we were to speculate on it, that feels like deeply unworthy of acceptance, and the exile is vulnerable, and he manages his life to avoid those feelings, and infidelity is a way that he copes with feelings of being unlovable or something like that. It's probably to speculate, but I don't think it could tell something about the habits or disposition.
about the language of external approximation of virtue, those cases where, say the adulterer, not Martin Luther King Jr., but, the judge who's just in his actions as a judge, but as an adulterer. So it's not the true virtue of courage or justice that he possesses, but it looks like it. He does just teach from a sort of outside point of view. So external approximation of virtue.
You kind of like in both of those contexts.
Sorry?
You're saying that like the judge is only like approximating virtue in the one
Right,
area.
so he's not truly just in the full. He doesn't have to have justice, but he still does just acts.
I don't know. I mean, that would be one possibility. I mean, if you're going to say that, you could say that. Or you could say with like NK Badwar, like that, it's virtue's actually domain specific. So you can be really just in domain A and really lack in domain B. Like a classic example, that's more like courage. Like, so you can have like a firefighter who's really good at physical courage domains, but like not so good at like speaking out as to justice in like different contexts.
Yeah.
So you could do the domain specific thing. I mean, for me that doesn't really work. That's also Mary Adams, I mentioned, like the modules of virtue, because it's just such a like disconnected. Like a virtuous person is supposed to be flourishing on a path of sanctification. That shouldn't be so piecemeal across domains of life. Like I'm really good over here, but then I, ignore over here. Maybe that is the reality. Like the problem is that I think, just like a kind of gut feel, that judge could actually really be just in that setting where he's dealing in that setting, and he just lacks it over here. And so I think the idea of like a struggle with sin that suggests like a kind of rival self can account for that in a way that can account for that reality where there really is a person growing in holiness and sanctification. And that part is just more expressed in this one domain, and then the sin is expressed in this other domain. So both of those are really there. Because it seems like if you don't say that, you have to discount too many occasions like King or this judge of like, I mean, maybe they are like just external approximations or some measure that doesn't get true virtue, but it gets to a point where it's kind of just like, well, geez, a king doesn't really have justice or certain other figures. It just starts to seem like kind of absurd to me. But maybe that isn't. I don't know. Maybe when you do encounter a truly virtuous person, like, oh yeah, it is. It's just in class domains, Just, I find them in the page of the scripture is one. So. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was wondering of a way of trying to reconcile the IFS idea of no bad parts with the Christian mystic vision. And I thought maybe one way to it would be the idea that we're always oriented toward the good. Even when we sin, we're not choosing evil as evil, but we're choosing something as good, but there's a flaw in it. So I wonder if that would be a way to kind of analyze that there's a part of us that's seeking some good, but in the wrong way or with the wrong understanding. And the sort of therapy involved is looking at that and realizing that it's not good logic or it's not achieving what you think you're doing by pursuing that.
Yeah, I think that actually could be a way you could do that. It's just, I think the problem you have doing that is that IFS would say, okay, well, it's not sinful then. And Aquinas would say, well, sure is, with like drastic implications. But maybe you could do something.
Time for two more. Final questions.
I think she already had.
Oh, just yet, sorry, go ahead.
Thank you. I agree with your impulse to say that you can't have a virtue in like one sphere and not in another. And I think I think we too had a very kind of a good impact on that, where for a long time it was just kind of accepted that like people could be good in like their professional life and then have like this really horrible predatory private life, and that could be kept separate, and that was okay. But then, with like intersectionality and media, like you have this a more universal understanding of like of a goodness of a person that can't be kind of discreetly sectioned off, so that you can't like justify the evil that someone does because of the good that they do. That relates to your topic as well, because it's almost always sexual propriety good for the church or is it not? Like, I would say not at all, because like you can't have a virtue in this kind of discrete way. It has to be a holistic, like striving towards sanctification.
Yeah. Yeah, like I agree with that. I think the piecemeal virtue, like that's a problem for adherence of that.
Yeah.
One of the like ways to think about it, let's say real quick, sorry. But like the major like exemplar theories, like we got with Plato, where it's like, okay, you gotta admire somebody and imitate what you admire, you know, like what you don't do this in real life, or like because like, well, you should really admire this person in this area, but just ignore what they do over here. You don't really do that. So yeah.
Thank you. I really appreciate the way you drew out the tension here between the moral life and psychological approach of IFS. I've listened a little bit to Schwartz's book, and one thing I've been trying to figure out if you can like qualify IFS by viewing it as a way of viewing man's relation to himself, because he doesn't seem to have much to say about about how sin is an abuse of our freedom in respect to God. But then, whenever I think about Christ revealing man to himself, I wonder if there's some way you would have any suggestions on how Christ could be brought into IFS methodology for trying to map out the self in a more insightful way.
Yeah, there's a couple books on that where Christian psychologists have tried to kind of reconcile these things. The names are escaping me right now, but if you shoot me an email, I'll send you some links to them. But yeah, I mean, I think that the one of the major criticisms I have of IFS, which I referenced there, that is very insular, and it just kind of submits that there's this kind of core virtuous self that's kind of like pre-packaged, just ready to go if you get the right techniques. And I don't think that's right. So I think that what it would look like is something like, well, I don't think you could explain it in this kind of like terminology or framework. It would be something like Mark 5, I think, where Christ encounters the person in the cemetery who's cutting himself, and then like after that encounter, the person's in right mind. I think you'd have to go at it something like that.
Thank you. Our final obligation, friends, is to thank our speakers.